Welcome to the Small Business Success Tips Podcast with me, your host, Neil McDonnell. In this podcast, we strive to provide key information and tips that will help small businesses like yours learn how to more effectively present your services to possible federal sector buyers. In each episode, a small business champion joins us to share their knowledge and experience with you. While they will have different titles, their common goal is to help the federal government benefit from what small businesses offer. These guests donate their time because they realize not everyone has the budget or time to meet them in person, and we definitely thank them for that. Our guest today is Valerie Muck, Director of the Air Force Small Business Programs. She is the #1 champion of small businesses in the Air Force, responsible for the success of the department's small business programs and management of the small business professionals throughout the Air Force. Valerie took responsibility of the Air Force small business programs in 2017, but has decades of experience supporting the department's mission in one form or another. I was particularly encouraged as a small business owner by her words to other small business professionals throughout the federal government in April 2018 at the DoD Small Business Training Week. She knows the value small businesses can provide to the Air Force in support of the mission priorities, and she works tirelessly in support of the success of small businesses, as you can see from the many events on her schedule, including the fact she's been traveling the last 3 weeks. So welcome, Valerie, and thank you for joining us today. For small businesses listening, you are the Air Force. Perhaps you can start off by telling us why you and the department's leadership value small businesses and their contribution.
First of all, thank you for having me. Second, I want to mention that decades of experience. It makes me sound really old. So I'm not really old, but this type of forum's new to me, and I'm really happy that you extended the invitation, and I'm excited to be here this morning. Air Force senior leadership knows that small businesses are the foundation of our defense industrial base. Our mission within the Air Force Office of Small Business Programs directly aligns to the National Defense Strategy. So if you're in any way, shape, or form associated with the Department of Defense, you're in tune with that National Defense Strategy and where we're headed. The first sentence of the National Defense Strategy states, "The Department of Defense's enduring mission is to provide combat-credible military forces needed to deter war and protect the security of our nation." End quote. We cannot have a combat-credible force without a strong industrial base, and we cannot have a strong industrial base without small businesses. The three basic tenets of the National Defense Strategy address building a more lethal force, strengthening our alliances and partnerships, and reforming the department for greater performance and affordability. If you look at our small business emblem, it states on our emblem, innovation, agility, efficiency. Those are three important traits that small businesses bring to the table, and three important links to the National Defense Strategy. So we can kind of bring it all back home. If we tie what we're doing in small business for the Air Force, we tie it right back to the National Defense Strategy. In addition, of the $56 billion in eligible Air Force obligations during fiscal year 2017, almost $11 billion of that went to small businesses. That's over 20% of our eligible dollars. That shows a strong commitment on the part of the Air Force at all levels, at the top level, at the major commands, down at the installation levels. And what we do it all for our warfighters. I wore the uniform, you've worn the uniform, many of the people that work for me wore their uniform. A lot of the small business owners out there wore a uniform. We do this, what we do for small businesses, for the men and women in uniform that lay their lives on the line every day to protect our nation and our freedoms. So that's why I do what I do, and that's why I'm really confident that our senior Air Force leadership is in tune with what's going on with small businesses.
No, I really appreciate that. Just even hearing you talk, I get little flashback reminders of the pride of being in uniform, even though I've been out 4 decades. And like you, I don't like saying decades, but it's there. Let's just go back a couple of years then, rather than longer. One of the things I wanted to ask before we got into some of the meat of tips is you're relatively new to this particular role. As I mentioned, you're not new to business in the Air Force and how the Air Force does business, but your last role had to do with acquisition integration. Can you just explain what that role was and what that means going forward? And maybe a piggyback question to that is, why did you take this role? I'm assuming it was offered and not forced on you. So, what motivated you to take this role?
So first of all, the context of my previous job, we did the planning, programming, and budgeting link between the financial management community and the folks out in the field who are actually doing the procurements, the buyers, the program managers, the contracting officers. So we were doing execution reviews on funding. We were looking in the out years for what programming actions were going to happen and how our industrial base was supporting those. We did policy that went out to the field. We did strategic planning for the acquisition community, and it's very well-rounded and robust job. I got to see so much of what happened in the Air Force while I was doing that job. My job previous to that, I was the Assistant Auditor General for acquisition, and financial audits across the Air Force. And so I've had acquisition in my blood for a long time, be it from an auditing perspective or being it from a headquarters level trying to help the acquisition community deliver to the warfighter. As to how I was selected for the job, I have just enough acquisition stink on me to be eligible to fulfill this job because there's actually statutory requirements on who can fill this position as a director of small business programs. So I had the necessary acquisition background to do it, and it kind of fit where I've been in my prior jobs with previous acquisition experience. And quite frankly, I come from a small business. I was raised in a small town in Michigan, and my grandparents owned a factory, and I often worked in that factory as a young child. Don't tell the labor folks right. Because I was probably not supposed to be doing what I was doing as a kid. But it really brought home to me when I was offered this job that now I can go out and come full circle really with what I did growing up and seeing what my grandparents went through, what my mom did because she worked for them directly, and kind of bring it back home. I'm really excited to be in this job and get to go out and meet with small business and see what their issues are and their struggles are, and see if there's any way that we can kind of break down the bureaucracy and make it a little easier for them to do business, not just with the government, but specifically with the Air Force, because it is tough. There's federal acquisition regulations, and then let's pile on the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, and then let's pile on the Air Force Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement. It's kind of hard to traverse through all these regulations and really get down to a person who can help a small business find where they need to go to do business with us. It's a tough environment, and I see my job in this role as trying to break down some of those barriers and at least have a friendly face, I hope it's a friendly face, or a friendly voice to talk to help steer them in the right direction and get to where they need to go.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. It's both a friendly voice and I saw you on video, so friendly face as well. You give a smile to the audience. And I might pull a thread, Valerie, on what you're saying, because that's perfect as it feeds into your experience in coming in and recognizing that it's tough for small businesses, and everybody kind of defines small businesses differently despite SBA having it really clear there. But to me, the way I define a small business is if you haven't really got traction yet. The fact that you have $2 million of revenue or something doesn't mean as much as you really knowing how to repeat that process and get 2 more million and 2 more million, which to me is all about helping American communities and hiring people. So you were talking about, yes, federal government, but really the Air Force in particular. And so maybe we can talk about homework, because that's the number one piece of advice I hear from you and your peers out there is you have to do your homework. But you're clearly recognizing that homework done by a larger company is different than homework done by a smaller company. What practical advice do you have for us on doing homework?
First step is to reach out in the local communities to your procurement technical assistance centers and your small business development centers, because they can help you with the basics on just, business development issues and kind of start getting your foot into the door with the government. The next step you need to do after you do that is reach out to the small business professionals across the Air Force and across the other services. I don't want to limit this just to an Air Force discussion. The Army and the Navy also have small business professionals across the U.S. And I work a lot with my counterparts in the Army and the Navy. We share lessons learned, and if we have a company come to us and it might not fit our needs, we throw it over the fence to the other, and hopefully they can take it and run with it. So reach out to the small business professionals. There are 158 small business professionals within the Air Force spread across the United States. And if you go out to our website, which is www.airforcesmallbiz, which is bizbiz.af.mil. If you go out there, there's a map out there, and it'll actually steer you to the small business professional in your area or region, or to a specific buying center that you're looking for. So that would be the second thing, is talk to a small business professional at the location that you're interested in doing business with, or at the location that does that type of business that you want to get into. For example, we have the Air Force Civil Engineering Center is down in San Antonio, Texas. So you might not be in San Antonio, Texas, but you might want to do work with the civil engineering folks. So you would want to be able to reach in there, even if you're in, Portland, Oregon. The other thing that companies need to do is monitor Fed Biz Ops and look at responding to requests for information and sources sought that are out there. We're talking a lot internally about not making those so rigorous, because a lot of times for small businesses, because it is such an investment in time, it's hard for them to respond to RFIs and sources sought. So you have to be really practical in which ones you pick and choose. But unless you respond to those, we don't know that you're out there. And if we want to try to apply the rule of two for set-asides, we need to know you're there. And the best way to do that is for requests for information and sources sought and hearing from you. And another thing my office does, if we find that a solicitation is unduly restrictive, we can step in and work with the contracting folks to see if maybe we can limit some of the restrictions. And I know sometimes they've had requirements for certain levels of certification by the folks that are going to be working on a contract, that we can work with our contracting officer and the requirements community to say, really, is that level of certification required? Can we lower it to this level, and then maybe have more opportunities for smaller businesses to get involved? So you have to be vocal. And I know that's hard when you're a small business, because you really got to carve out the time to be vocal. But when there's something that really piques your interest that you'd like to get involved with, you're going to have to be vocal. You're going to have to search out the right folks to talk to. And if you can't get a hold of somebody on the contracting side that's maybe listed on the request for information, always reach out to the small business professionals. If you can't get a small business professional out in the field, you can always contact my office, and we'll help steer you in the right direction.
No, that's perfect. And I like to say that in the federal government, it's more like a buffet than a plated wedding. I think sometimes people sit around like an FBO waiting for the plate of food to get put in front of them. It's like, no, you have to stand up, go to the table, which means writing a response to sources sought, reaching out. There's limits, obviously, but if you keep your core competency focused, then it makes it easier. I wanted to ask you about the small business professionals and maybe test you a little bit on your mastery of numbers of people in the Air Force. But you said there's 158 small business professionals. I want to ask you questions about them, but I'm just curious, any idea how many buyers there are out there? We see contracting officers constantly in FBO. I'm curious on what that pool of people are in the Air Force.
I can tell you there are a whole lot more of them than there are of us. And I don't have the exact number. I can get you an approximation probably, but that's going to number in the thousands.
Okay, and that's what I figured. It starts becoming a really big world where you can make a footprint just by beginning to reach out to these people. So small business professionals, you said, I'm going to leave your first tip aside because it's my number one tip as well, is that if you're new to business, go to the SBDC. If you're new to the government, go to PTAC. And both of those, we do separate podcasts and actual panels with them, and we try to drive small businesses that way. But your second tip was small business professionals. As we reach out, how do we use that relationship? What's some of the early recommendations you might have for talking to small business professionals?
Don't wait to reach out until there's something on Fed Biz Ops that you're interested in. Start building the relationship now. with only 158 small business professionals, and 10 of those are on my staff, so they're up here at the headquarters. So let's say out in the field there's 150 of them, and at any one time they're probably overworked with looking at acquisition programs and doing outreach and doing training, so they get really busy. If you don't hear back from them, keep trying, and if you still don't hear back, let us know, and we'll interject and try to get you hooked up. But it's starting that relationship before there's really even a procurement that you're interested in, and asking them the questions, taking your capability statement into them and having them review it. Because a second ago you mentioned something about maybe somebody's niche or what they're good at and focusing on that. I've had some companies talk to me about what their product is, and it ranges from we sell hammers to the Air Force, and we're providing advisory and assistance services for nuclear physicists. And it's like, wait a minute, what's your core competency? You really need to know what you're good at and focus on that. And if you sit down with a small business professional in the Air Force, they can help you kind of scope what you're looking for from a product and service perspective of where this is to go, because it might not be at that installation that you're close to. It might be down in San Antonio, Texas, or at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio. That might be where the actual buying takes place. So you might not know that talking to the small business until you talk to that small business professional out in the field. So I encourage you, start those discussions early, and make sure they know who you are. Be a little bit of a pest. Don't tell them I said that. But I think sometimes if you're there and you're engaging and you're excited about what you're doing, that's half the battle, and they can help steer you in the right direction.
No, that's perfect. And I feel this might be a bad time to tell you we're recording this. No,
I know.
I know.
I'm just not going to tell any of my small business professionals out there that it's recorded, and they'll never know what I said, right?
Right. Actually, I was going to say small business professionals tell us the same thing, because we've had several of them on this podcast as well, and they say the same thing. If you're not letting us know who you are, then how on earth can we help you? And then if you come and you need something done by them by Monday, and you're coming on a Friday, it's like, well, that's unrealistic. It's unrealistic for almost everything, including fixing your air conditioning. So getting out there early.
Let me pull the string on that. I've had, when I've been out talking to my small business professionals, because you mentioned I'm relatively new in the job. I've been in the job about 15 months now. But when I'm out there talking to my small business professionals and talking to them about how they engage with industry, a lot of times they'll have a company come in, give them their capability statement, and the small business professional 3 months later they'll find out there's a procurement coming up, and they'll be able to call that company back and say, hey, heads up. So you got to do it before that procurement comes up. You got to build that relationship, and they're going to have you in the back of their mind. They're going to have you in their Rolodex, so to speak. They're going to have your capability statement on file. So again, do it early.
No, that's perfect. And so let me kind of go along that line with the small business specialist or professional, because they're out at all these different locations. When I think about, one of my biggest pieces of advice to small businesses is, if you're under $5 million, just keep subcontracting. Subcontract all day long. In fact, really the only reason you need prime is if you ever envision selling your company, because otherwise either one of them generate revenue and create jobs. But certainly when you're less experienced, subcontracting gives you free training from the prime. But a lot of smalls want to get that first prime. What's your advice on the easiest point of entry for small businesses to get that first prime contract?
Can I take it back a step first? Because I want to convey the importance of subcontracting, especially in the current environment, for the Air Force. The Air Force, we have a lot of very large procurements going on right now. A small business will not win a contract on the ground-based strategic deterrence, or we've got the F-35, or they're going to be a subcontract on these big procurements, and we have a lot of big procurements. So you really want to be able to subcontract. Another thing that's impacting us from a subcontracting perspective is category management and where we're headed with best-in-class vehicles. This is being driven out of the Office of Management and Budget, and the Air Force is really taking this to heart on category management. I am an advisor on the Category Management Council, and I try to stay in tune with what's happening within the Air Force, but I can tell you that on a lot of our procurements for advisory and assistance services, for example, we are going to large contracting vehicles to get things done. Some of these large contracting vehicles have subcontracting pools, or not subcontracting, the small business pools, so we can get to small businesses that way. A lot of them, though, there are full and open competition. So a small business would need to either partner with a small business that's in a small business pool or partner with a business that's in the full and open competition area, because that might be the only way they're going to get to that work. So subcontracting is vital to be able to get to that work within the Air Force and within the larger context of the government. To get to a point where you're ready to prime, I say cut your teeth on those subcontracting areas, especially when you're dealing with the Department of Defense, because it is so bureaucratic. And if you can show you've got good performance under the subcontracts and kind of prove your name, it will help you when the time comes for you to prime on something. And it just depends on the type of work and the scope and volume of the work that you're looking to get involved in. I do tell folks when I'm out speaking, don't sign up for something that you can't fulfill. You need to make sure that you're only putting in to be a prime on something where you're going to be able to deliver to cost, schedule, and performance. Because if you fail, you're not only failing for yourself as a small business, you're also painting a brush for all the other small businesses out there. And I can't tell you how many times I've been out there talking to program managers or contracting officers, and they say, well, we used a small business before and we got burnt, and so we don't want to use a small business on this solicitation because we think they don't have the ability to do it. So make sure as a small business that you're really taking it to heart when you respond to a request for proposal, that you can really commit to fulfilling from a cost, schedule, and a performance perspective.
No, that's perfect. I appreciate it. And I think just listening to you, I might even get stronger in my advocacy of just staying as a sub until people start asking you to prime. There's kind of that rule when they ask you to run for office, now you know you're ready or something. But if you want to run for office, maybe it's not the time. I think that came like back in the Jefferson and Adams time frame.
Yeah, it's just the environment right now. It's tough the way we're headed with these big best-in-class vehicles. And especially from a local and a regional perspective, these small businesses are being impacted because for example, the Air Force out at Air Force Space Command, we're going to a large best-in-class vehicle, and those small local businesses that were previously supporting the installation, they're not on that best-in-class vehicle. So they need to reach out to those companies that are on that vehicle and try to sub through them so that they're still getting the work. And I know folks want to be the prime and they want to kind of run their own show, but it's a tough business right now to be able to do that.
Well, and really, I mean, that's kind of the idea is, as we look at it, maybe we transition a little bit even more local. I was talking with actually Tommy Marks from the Army, and we did a panel with him and a couple of his colleagues from the Army Corps of Engineers, but we were talking about this similar type of question, but he was describing base operations. What does base operations look like for the Air Force, and how that might be options for small businesses? For example, we actually did an Air Force panel, and you and I could chat offline about that, but in there we had the Tinker Air Force small business specialist out there, or director, and talking about how to get into some of these bases around the country, especially just CONUS.
So from a base operations perspective, again, you're gonna want to hone in with the small business professional at that location. And if you had our person on that was out at Tinker Air Force Base, that's where I was earlier this week. So it was a great visit. You have to also look at the size and the scope of the work that base operations entail. That's a really sweeping category. Base operations runs from everything from snow removal to refuse collection to providing library services. So there's a whole lot of stuff that falls in there. Some of them have large contracts that cover the full gamut of everything they do on the base operations area, so you would have to subcontract in to do that work. Others are doing more, pieces and parts on the installation where, you might do a paving contract or something. Again, some of those contracts are getting rolled up into larger regional or enterprise level contracts. So you might not just be able to do a paving contract at base X, but you have to be on a larger vehicle that covers that region, or an enterprise level vehicle that covers the whole Air Force. So you, again, have to do your homework to know what operations and how that's contracted out at that specific installation, because it can be different depending on where you're at.
So if I'm snow removal, for example, talking with the small business professionals, the quickest way for me to find out, is this locally procured or regionally and nationally?
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. Just a side question. Is there a link or a site where I might be able to find all the Air Force, all these large vehicles, not just the best in practice, but just any of the vehicles that are out there?
I can get that for you. There is a list that the Office of Management and Budget puts out that has the best-in-class vehicles listed. So I can get that to you so you can share it with your listeners.
That's perfect. Thanks. So I'll follow up and do that. So okay. As we kind of wrap into, we're heading to the end of the podcast. Got a few more minutes, but I wanted to ask two kind of closing questions. One, and both of them are around best practices, and maybe forcing you to kind of think of new tips for us. But if there's one tip that you can give us that you see small businesses out there doing really well, and that's successful for them doing business with the Air Force, what would that tip be? What can the rest of us mimic?
So a tip I would say would be passionate about what you do and really know what you do. I mentioned this earlier. Know what you're good at. What's your niche? And then go in and be ready to sell that. You are your best advocate, so make sure that you are putting your best foot forward, that if you have past performance, that you're putting that forward and showing that you've been able to do the job, that you're capable and you have the capacity to do it, and then just really be passionate about what you can bring to the Air Force and what you're going to deliver to the warfighter. How are you going to make us a more lethal force and protect our national security? Where do you fit in? How do you fit in?
That's perfect. And kind of doing the flip side of that, when you think, Valerie, what we do out there as small businesses, that if you could wave a magic wand, what's one thing that you would really, one or two things that you'd like to see us just stop doing?
Stop doing? I don't know. That's a tougher one, probably. I'd probably turn that onto, again, the promise what deliver what you promise. Make sure that you are putting your best foot forward and focus on, the cost part, the schedule part, and most importantly, the performance part. Make sure you're performing and kind of putting that in context of what we need as a customer, because ultimately that's what we are. We're the customer, and we have a requirement, and we need to have that fulfilled. And the ultimate customer, our warfighter, is, very much reliant on what you're delivering. You might not think it's directly linked, but in the big scheme of things, it fits into the bigger picture. So we need to make sure we're doing the best thing to deliver goods and services to support our warfighters.
No, I really like that. I've always supported the VA, has always been my kind of biggest customer in the past, and I've always attributed everything, and I was on IT back then, always down to the care of the patient, care of the vet. And so I appreciate that tip about doing what we say we're going to do and just do a great job. So I want to say thank you very much, Valerie. I appreciate it. I know I speak for our listeners when I say thank you for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and great tips. Can you let our listeners know how they can reach you or your office?
Sure. I just want to put one more plug into a couple of things that we've got going on.
Sure.
One of them is the Air Force has stood up AFWorks. So you've probably heard of AFWorks. If you
Yep.
listening to the news, we have a location in Las Vegas, one in Austin, Texas, which just opened up a few weeks ago, and one here in Washington, D.C. That's kind of a storefront or hub on how you can get in. Those are more technology focused. We're looking for innovation. That's a real important part of what we're doing. So encourage folks, if they have a technology or innovation that they want to put forward, is to go out to the AFWorks site, and you can it's AFWorks, AFWERX. If you just Google that, it'll pull it up. Our site, which also has a link to that and to other things like the Small Business Innovation Research Area and links to the different major commands and the installations, is www.airforcesmallbiz.af.mil. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. So if there are any activities going out in the field, any events, like we just had an event out at Tinker Air Force Base, Tinker in the Primes. I was out there. We put that feed out there on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and we also put it on our calendar that's on our website, so you can know what industry type events are going on and where we're doing outreach.
That's perfect. Thank you very much. And we'll put those links for everybody on our show notes. As we wrap up this episode, I wanted to remind the listeners of a few things. First, click the subscribe button to make sure you're notified when new episodes are released. This also helps those of us who work on the podcast know you're out there and listening. Second, if you find the podcast valuable and think others would, please share a note about us on LinkedIn or one of the other social media platforms. I'm your host, Neil McDonnell. I thank you for listening to this episode and hope you'll join us again for other episodes. Remember, you're just one contract away. Go make it happen.